It is my testimony that the border is secure, and we are working every day, day and night, to increase its security.
Alejandro Mayorkas, once a vocal advocate for transparency on border issues, has just exposed a chilling secret about what was really happening behind the scenes. His revelation has drawn several surprising senators into the spotlight, raising fears that the very foundation of the American government may collapse. The illusion of control. Alejandro Mayorkas, the man who once stood as the face of Homeland Security under President Joe Biden, is now at the center of a storm that has exposed one of the most disturbing national security crises in recent memory. After years of silence, evasive testimony, and mounting criticism, he has finally been cornered into revealing details that paint a chilling picture of America's border. What has emerged is not just a political scandal, but a terrifying revelation that many in Washington wanted hidden. From the moment the Biden administration took office, immigration policy became one of the most polarizing issues in the nation. Within weeks, the administration reversed key measures from the Trump era, halting border wall construction, scaling back deportation priorities, and scrapping the Remain in Mexico policy. Mayorkas, tasked with overseeing this massive shift, assured Americans that the border was secure and under control. Yet, as migrant surges mounted, lawmakers and border officials accused him of presiding over the most dangerous unraveling of border enforcement in modern U.S. history. The narrative of a secure border directly collided with the testimonies of frontline agents, governors, senators, and even grieving families who witnessed the fallout firsthand. The truth was bleeding through congressional hearings and press reports, and each time Mayorkas was pressed under oath, his evasions only deepened suspicion. In one exchange, Mayorkas declared,
"It is my testimony that the border is secure, and we are working every day, day and night, to increase its security."
The claim drew outrage. Republican senators immediately challenged him, pointing to record-breaking numbers of migrant encounters, drug seizures, and cartel-linked violence. Senator Ted Cruz delivered one of the most heated confrontations in recent congressional history. Pressing Mayorkas repeatedly on whether there was a crisis at the southern border, Cruz demanded a clear answer. Mayorkas refused, instead describing it as a significant challenge. The stonewalling led Cruz to contrast his response with sworn testimony from Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz, who had testified under oath that the border was indeed in crisis.
Would you agree, Chief Ortiz, that the southern border is currently in crisis?
Objection.
Yes.
By refusing to give the same answer, Mayorkas immediately drew accusations of dishonesty. Cruz went further, confronting him with statistics on migrant deaths. In 2022 alone, at least 853 migrants died attempting to cross the southern border, the highest ever recorded. Cruz cited reports of drowned bodies in the Rio Grande and refrigerated trucks kept by local authorities to store the dead. The horror was undeniable, yet Mayorkas claimed he did not have the numbers at hand.
853.
That is
853. And by the way, here are the numbers that have died every year. You go back to 1998, you see it's consistently between 300 and 400, 300, 400, 300, 400. Suddenly, 2021, what happens? You get in office, and that red line are dead bodies.
The exchanges did not stop there. Cruz demanded to know how many murderers, rapists, or child predators had been released into the United States under Mayorkas' tenure. Again, the secretary dodged, refusing to provide figures. The senator accused him of deliberately refusing to track or disclose dangerous data because it would expose the administration's failure. The accusations escalated into the darkest territory imaginable. Cruz presented evidence that drug cartels were not only smuggling narcotics and controlling vast swaths of border territory, but were also using migrant wristbands to mark payments, effectively turning humans into commodities. He charged that children were being funneled into modern-day slavery, including forced labor and exploitation.
You have turned these cartels into multi-billion-dollar criminal organizations, and these are modern-day leg irons, because these are children being sold into sex slavery.
Mayorkas' response, claiming ignorance about the wristbands, further enraged senators and fueled claims that he was either lying or dangerously incompetent. The fallout was immediate. Headlines declared that DHS under Mayorkas had lost operational control of the border, a phrase with specific legal weight. In sworn testimony, when asked if the administration had operational control as defined by federal law, meaning the prevention of all unlawful entries, Mayorkas had answered yes. That statement became the basis of one of the most repeated charges against him, that he had knowingly lied under oath to Congress. Representative Chip Roy was among the most vocal accusers.
The Secretary of Homeland Security sat at that table, looked at me in the face of a statute defining operational control, and said to me and to this committee and all Americans watching that this administration has operational control of our border. And it's a flat lie.
This theme of distrust became the foundation of impeachment proceedings filed against him. Lawmakers accused Mayorkas not merely of incompetence, but of willfully deceiving Congress and the American public. To them, this was not negligence, it was a betrayal. The accusations carried severe weight because the fallout from his policies was visible everywhere. A massive increase in gotaways, migrants who successfully evaded Border Patrol, estimated at more than 600,000 annually. Over 5.5 million illegal crossings recorded since Biden took office, the highest in U.S. history. Surging deaths from fentanyl overdoses, tied directly to smuggling operations across the border. Reports of human trafficking networks exploiting children, with many ending up in brutal labor or worse. In one hearing, Senator Josh Hawley unleashed a scathing attack, accusing Mayorkas of enabling what he bluntly called child slavery. He cited reporting from the New York Times that revealed children as young as 13 and 14 were working overnight shifts in slaughterhouses and factories after crossing into the United States unaccompanied. Hawley's words were shocking, not only for their bluntness, but for what they revealed. The Department of Homeland Security, under Mayorkas, had reportedly lost track of tens of thousands of unaccompanied minors. Many disappeared into the shadows, unmonitored, and later surfaced in investigative reports working in violation of child labor laws. The evidence of betrayal piled higher. In Yuma, Arizona, local officials accused Mayorkas directly of lying to their faces. Supervisor Jonathan Lines testified that Mayorkas had promised to address 9 major gaps in the border wall near Yuma, but had failed to follow through. When asked if this was a matter of ability or will, Lines was blunt. For border communities, the consequences were devastating. Hospitals became overwhelmed with migrant births, straining NICUs to the point where local residents had to be flown over 170 miles away to receive care. Cartel-linked violence spilled across the border, with more than 200 targeted killings in nearby Mexican cities reported in just over a year. To locals, the border was no longer a line of defense but an open wound. Congressman Clay Higgins summarized the devastation in one of the most emotional tirades delivered in the chamber. Accusing Mayorkas of aligning DHS policy with cartel operations, Higgins charged that the secretary's leadership had destroyed the morale of Border Patrol agents, created generational trauma for American families, and presided over a tide of drug overdoses that killed more than 200,000 Americans.
Before the whole country. Your legacy. Millions of illegals enter our country. Millions under your watch. Loss of operational control of our border. Aligning DHS policy as an asset to Mexican cartel drug and human trafficking.
By the time impeachment articles were formally introduced, Mayorkas had become one of the most embattled cabinet members in modern U.S. history. The charges were clear: lying to Congress, dereliction of duty, willful refusal to enforce federal immigration law, and facilitating a humanitarian and security catastrophe. Even as these accusations swirled, Mayorkas attempted to defend his record by framing the crisis in global terms. He argued that mass migration was not unique to the United States, but part of a worldwide displacement crisis.
The number of encounters at the southern border is very high, but it's very, very important, number one, to contextualize it, and number two, to explain it. From a context perspective, the world is seeing the greatest level of displacement since at least World War.
It was an explanation meant to deflect blame, but it did little to calm critics. To them, global displacement was irrelevant to the fact that U.S. policy choices, ending Remain in Mexico, halting wall construction, and loosening deportation priorities, had directly triggered the crisis. The situation reached a tipping point when Mayorkas' own credibility collapsed under bipartisan scrutiny. Even Democrats expressed unease, though few joined Republicans in calling for impeachment. What united both sides, however, was the recognition that America's border crisis was spiraling beyond control. At the heart of it all was a chilling revelation. While officials insisted the border was secure, the reality was that drug cartels, human traffickers, and organized crime networks had gained unprecedented influence over who entered the United States. Reports of cartel-controlled wristbands, migrant exploitation, and fentanyl flooding across checkpoints suggested that enforcement had not only failed, it had been co-opted. And in hearings across Capitol Hill, lawmakers were beginning to say the quiet part out loud. This was not a crisis born of incompetence. It was, they charged, a deliberate strategy, enabled and covered up by the very man sworn to defend the nation's borders: the human cost. The revelations surrounding Alejandro Mayorkas did not stop at accusations of incompetence or lying to Congress. As more investigations unfolded, hearings intensified, and whistleblowers came forward, a much darker reality emerged. The U.S. southern border was no longer a security checkpoint. It had become a corridor for cartels, a marketplace for traffickers, and, most disturbingly, a graveyard of children caught in systemic exploitation. One of the most damning revelations came in the form of investigative reporting from the New York Times, which documented how unaccompanied migrant children, thousands of whom crossed the border under Mayorkas' tenure, ended up in brutal child labor conditions across the United States. Senators seized on these findings during tense hearings. Senator Josh Hawley exposed the scope of the crisis in a scathing statement, citing evidence of more than 250,000 unaccompanied migrant children crossing in just 2 years, with tens of thousands effectively lost by the federal government.
Let's not mince words. They've been sold into slavery. When kids are being put into factories, forced to work overnight, forced to work in terrible conditions, they're not getting paid, they're not going to school, sometimes they're not getting fed. That's slavery.
The senator pointed to cases like Carolina, a 15-year-old girl from Guatemala who was discovered packaging Cheerios in a Michigan factory overnight, surrounded by dangerous machinery that had already caused serious injuries to other workers. Her testimony, "Sometimes I get tired and feel sick," underscored the inhumanity of what critics called indentured servitude, disguised as opportunity. Senator Marsha Blackburn pressed further in another hearing, citing the figure of 345,807 unaccompanied children who had crossed under Mayorkas' watch. Many, she argued, vanished into the shadows, funneled into industries like roofing, slaughterhouses, and dishwashing in violation of child labor laws.
Thousands of children have ended up in punishing jobs across the country, working overnight in slaughterhouses, replacing roofs, operating machinery in factories, all in violation of child labor laws.
The horrifying detail was not just that the government lost track of these children, but that whistleblowers inside Health and Human Services reported being pressured to release kids faster, even if it meant sending them into dangerous situations. It created what critics called a conveyor belt of children. This was the heart of the terrifying border secret. The policies designed under Mayorkas to speed up migrant processing had created loopholes so vast that children were effectively being delivered into the hands of traffickers, unscrupulous sponsors, and industries hungry for cheap labor. But the crisis extended far beyond child labor. Cartels had seized near total control of smuggling operations along the border. Testimony from Yuma officials described how cartel violence in nearby Mexican towns had escalated to the point of 200 targeted assassinations in just over a year. Law enforcement officers were routinely ambushed, their killings spilling fear into U.S. border communities.
Over the last 14 months, the sheriff and I have been made aware of over 200 assassinations in San Luis Rio, Colorado, where the cartels are targeting law enforcement.
With cartels now controlling smuggling routes, wristbands were used to mark migrants like inventory, each color coding the amount of money owed. Senator Cruz confronted Mayorkas with these wristbands in one of the most chilling exchanges in modern hearings.
And if you go to the southern border, along the southern border, you see thousands of these wristbands because the illegal immigrants wear them. The drug cartels, every color corresponds to how many thousands of dollars they owe the cartels.
These revelations painted a devastating picture. Cartels had not only taken control of smuggling, they had turned human migration into a multi-billion-dollar industry, with the U.S. border effectively acting as their cash register. The result was an unprecedented wave of fentanyl flooding into the United States. Customs and Border Protection seized record amounts, but the seizures were only a fraction of what made it through. Over 100,000 overdose deaths in a single year were linked directly to fentanyl, much of it traced back to cartel supply chains. Senator Cruz connected these deaths directly to Mayorkas' policies.
What's the result of massive gotaways? Well, one of the results is drug overdoses. And we now have, last year, over 100,000 overdoses who died, the majority from Chinese fentanyl streaming across the border.
In another explosive moment, Representative Clay Higgins accused Mayorkas of effectively becoming an asset to the cartels, alleging that DHS had deliberately avoided deploying technology that could disrupt their business model.
I have evidence in my file that you've given command to not deploy technology that you currently have. because it interfered with the cartel's business model.
But perhaps the most disturbing element of this story came with the rollout of the CBP One app, which critics dubbed a concierge service for illegal immigration. Launched under Mayorkas, the app allowed migrants to schedule appointments at ports of entry using a smartphone. Senator Josh Hawley grilled Mayorkas on this program, exposing how tens of thousands of migrants were able to reserve slots to enter the U.S. without asylum interviews, background checks, or security screenings. Reports from Texas Monthly confirmed that the app required no proof of asylum claims, no vetting questions, and resulted in mass releases into the interior. Hawley likened it to Ticketmaster for illegal immigrants.
Those arriving for the CBP One appointments are given no interviews, asked no questions about vulnerabilities that they may or may not have listed in the app or about why they're coming to the United States. They're simply released into the country.
The implications were staggering. By enabling migrants to schedule entry rather than attempting dangerous crossings, the administration argued that the app reduced chaos. But to critics, it was the ultimate admission that DHS was no longer stopping illegal immigration. It was managing and facilitating it. The terrifying secret was no longer speculation. The Department of Homeland Security under Mayorkas had transformed the border from a barrier into a system of managed entry that cartels exploited, children suffered under, and adversaries used to infiltrate the United States. National security concerns escalated when reports surfaced of Chinese nationals crossing the southern border in record numbers. Senator Hawley highlighted that encounters of Chinese nationals in the Rio Grande Valley had surged 900%, with many released into the U.S. interior. He pressed Mayorkas on whether any were members of the Chinese Communist Party. Mayorkas refused to answer. The refusal to disclose whether CCP-linked individuals had entered fueled suspicions that adversarial nations could exploit border chaos to insert operatives. Meanwhile, gotaways, migrants who evaded capture altogether, reached unprecedented levels. Estimates placed the number at over 600,000 annually. Senators repeatedly demanded to know how many among them were violent criminals or potential terrorists. Mayorkas provided no numbers. The silence was deafening. To critics, it meant DHS had no real grasp of who was entering the country, leaving Americans vulnerable to threats ranging from cartel operatives to terrorist cells. Senator Ted Cruz encapsulated the horror by confronting Mayorkas on reports of sexual assault, exploitation, and children sold into slavery. When asked directly how many children had been trafficked under his watch, Mayorkas refused to answer. Cruz delivered the most damning line of the hearings.
How many children have been sold into sex slavery? Do you know how many children have been sold into sex slavery?
To an unprecedented degree.
Mr. Secretary, I want to say to you right now, your behavior is disgraceful, and the deaths, the children assaulted, the children raped, they are at your feet.
This moment crystallized the scandal. It was no longer about policy differences. It was about whether a government official sworn to protect national security had enabled, through deception or deliberate design, a system that empowered cartels, endangered children, and placed the American public at risk. By the close of 2024, impeachment articles against Mayorkas had been filed, citing his refusal to enforce immigration laws and his repeated lies to Congress. Though the Senate blocked removal, the charges left a permanent stain. In early 2025, under the Trump administration, the consequences became personal. Mayorkas' Secret Service protection was revoked, an almost unprecedented punishment for a former cabinet secretary. Critics charged that the decision symbolized what Mayorkas had done to America. By betraying border security, he had forfeited protection for himself. The terrifying secret was now in the open. Under Mayorkas' leadership, the border had not simply failed. It had become an entry point for exploitation, crime, and national security risks. The facade of control was shattered, revealing a deliberate system of managed chaos. And yet, there was more still to come. The terrifying secret. By the time 2025 dawned, Alejandro Mayorkas had become one of the most polarizing figures in American politics. His name, once known mainly in bureaucratic circles, now echoed in fiery congressional hearings, presidential speeches, and town halls across the country. To his critics, he was the architect of the most catastrophic border collapse in modern history. To his defenders, he was a scapegoat for global migration pressures. But the revelations that followed his resignation left little doubt that his tenure had concealed a devastating reality, one that was now impossible to deny. The political fallout reached a dramatic climax when former President Donald Trump returned to power after the 2024 election, took the extraordinary step of revoking Mayorkas' Secret Service protection. Reported by outlets like The Gateway Pundit and confirmed by official executive action, this marked a nearly unprecedented move against a former cabinet member.
President Trump has revoked Secret Service protection from former Department of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas, a move which has sparked debate. The decision, reported by the Gateway Pundit, came via an executive order stripping Mayorkas of security detail effective immediately.
Trump justified the decision by pointing directly to Mayorkas' impeachment by the House in February 2024 for mishandling the southern border crisis, an impeachment that failed in the Senate but left a permanent mark. According to Trump, protection was reserved for individuals who safeguarded the United States, not those who risked it.
Critics, including Trump, have long accused Alejandro Mayorkas of enabling an open border, which allowed 15 million illegals to come into the country, of which nearly 1 million are criminals. The revocation marks a rare instance of a former cabinet member losing protection. Typically reserved for high-risk individuals, Trump said, well, you risk the United States of America, so you're on your own.
The spectacle shocked Washington. Never before had a former Homeland Security Secretary been stripped of such protections, effectively leaving him exposed. The move symbolized Trump's central argument that Mayorkas had betrayed his oath, endangered millions, and would now face the consequences without government shield. But Trump did not stop there. In a campaign-style rally, he openly suggested that Mayorkas might face criminal prosecution for his actions as DHS Secretary. Trump's words carried a chilling undertone. Mayorkas, once a powerful federal official, could soon find himself the target of legal retribution. The suggestion electrified his supporters, many of whom had long viewed Mayorkas as personally responsible for fentanyl deaths, cartel violence, and the chaos along the border. Meanwhile, Mayorkas himself finally broke his silence in a series of rare exit interviews after leaving DHS. In a widely covered CNBC appearance, he reflected on his tenure, admitting that internal disagreements over immigration policy had shaped many of the outcomes.
I wish that we had more time, and that would enable us to do more, not only in furtherance of our mission, but in the service of the American people.
Pressed on whether he personally disagreed with Biden's policy decisions, halting the wall, pausing deportations, and ending the Remain in Mexico policy, Mayorkas dodged specifics, but admitted there had been differences within the administration.
People have different views on what the correct policies should be, what the correct operational measures should be. Those disagreements, those different views are voiced, decisions are made, and then everyone marches in unity together. That is the nature of a large organization.
Critics seized on this as confirmation of what they had long suspected. Mayorkas knew some of the policies were disastrous, but implemented them anyway. To them, this meant his defense of just following orders was no shield against accountability. Perhaps the most striking moment of his interview came when he contextualized the crisis not as an American failure, but as part of a worldwide migration surge, the largest since World War II. But while he sought to globalize the problem, his critics returned to one inescapable fact. The United States alone had the resources, the wall, the policies, and the precedent to stop the chaos. Yet under his leadership, it had chosen not to. On Capitol Hill, anger remained fierce. Senators like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley repeatedly reminded the public that Mayorkas had dodged direct questions about migrant deaths, child trafficking, and national security risks. Congressman Clay Higgins accused him of deliberately undermining Border Patrol morale and aligning DHS with cartel interests. The anger transcended party lines, with even moderates questioning how such catastrophic failures could have persisted. The crisis also had devastating human faces. Ranchers along the Rio Grande reported dead migrants on their property. Parents of overdose victims pointed to fentanyl supply lines tied directly to cartel networks. Local hospitals in border states described NICUs filled beyond capacity due to migrant births, forcing residents to travel hundreds of miles for care. These stories gave weight to the claim that the federal government had abandoned its primary duty, protecting its citizens. By early 2025, the debate had crystallized into a single haunting revelation: the terrifying border secret. Despite years of public assurances, the United States had not merely lost control of its border, it had ceded it. Cartels controlled entry points, migrants paid with wristbands, children disappeared into labor networks, fentanyl poured in. Foreign nationals, including those from adversarial powers, slipped through, and the Department of Homeland Security, instead of defending the line, had facilitated the system with apps, parole programs, and mass releases. It was not a failure of enforcement, it was the creation of controlled chaos. This secret, exposed through congressional congressional hearings, investigative reports, and Mayorkas' own admissions painted a bleak picture. The U.S. border was no longer designed to stop unlawful entry. It had been redesigned to process it, manage it, and disguise it under bureaucratic language. What Mayorkas once called lawful pathways became the very tools exploited by traffickers and cartels. Senator Cruz put it bluntly when confronting Mayorkas.
This is a crisis, it's a disgrace, and you won't even admit this human tragedy is a crisis.
For millions of Americans, the consequences were not abstract. They were felt in skyrocketing overdose deaths, surging crime tied to trafficking networks, overwhelmed schools and hospitals, and the trauma of communities left to face cartel-fueled violence without federal protection. In this final reckoning, Mayorkas' silence over the years no longer appeared as loyalty to his administration. It was seen as complicity in hiding the truth. And when he finally spoke, admitting disagreements, deflecting blame to global displacement, and defending managed entry programs, the damage was already done. Donald Trump's revocation of protection and open talk of prosecution symbolized a larger reality. Alejandro Mayorkas, once entrusted with America's security, had become the face of its greatest vulnerability. His name would be forever tied to the years when the border ceased to function as a line of defense and instead became a corridor of chaos. The terrifying secret he finally revealed, whether willingly or under pressure, was that the border crisis was not an accident. It was the product of deliberate choices, defended with lies, concealed under euphemisms, and carried out at a cost of countless lives. And for millions of Americans watching the hearings, the interviews, and the headlines, one haunting conclusion remained. If the border itself can no longer protect the nation, then the nation's greatest vulnerability lies not beyond the line, but within it. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative and interesting, be sure to check out other similar and amazing videos on the screen. See you in the next video.